Today, for our first long-form video, we will be reacting to a video made by MentisWave. We skipped some of the fluff of the video, since if we were to react to every small fallacy, we would need to make a 1 hour long video. However, we did try to respond to his main points.
When it comes to Marxism, socialist systems tend to have a problem with them constantly leading down the path to corrupt dictatorships and other authoritarian disasters. It's kind of a twisted irony, really, that this system supposedly designed to give us equality keeps giving us one of the most unequal types of societies in terms of power dynamics between the people and the state. Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, Castro's Cuba, Kim Il-sung's North Korea, just to name some. Whenever a country follows the ideology of Marxist-Leninism, or similar enough such as Juche where it doesn't really matter, it somehow keeps giving us a totalitarian state.
Was this really a product of socialism? Was Nazi Germany socialist? Is modern China, Africa, or Russia socialist?
So at least from a historical perspective, this problem they have with totalitarianism has plenty of examples, and is fairly indisputable. Unless, of course, you want to get into the fun conspiracy theories about how all the problems that historians largely agree on actually never happened, and are all evil capitalist big propaganda. Yet, the reason for these disasters seem to continue to fly right over the heads of Marxists, every single time as they find ways to blame everything but their own terrible ideology for this consistent track record of epic failure.
At this point, he is just attacking Marxists as individuals, and generalizing a wrong stereotype across all Marxists. Most Marxists would agree that past socialist governments did have some issues.
So really, why does Marxism lead us to totalitarianism? Why does the pipeline exist, and how does it work? To summarize, the pipeline is composed of three major elements that feed off each other in a way that continuously grants the state more and more power. First, it strips people of their individual identity and replaces it with collectivist identity, making people subservient, unquestioning of authority, and easy to control via propaganda and social shaming. Second, it forcibly transfers ownership of private property to the state under the misguided belief that the state will use this power for the good of equality. Spoiler alert, they won't. Third, it creates an anti-competitive economic environment as people become increasingly disallowed from any kind of investment that would compete with the state's control of enterprise, sometimes just banning all private enterprise outright.
If by competition you mean different corporations competing on who can exploit their workers more efficiently, then yes, it does remove it. But it does not remove competition entirely, as there were multiple factories, multiple mines, multiple construction boroughs that competed with each other in socialist countries such as the USSR. For example, when new designs were needed for a new plane, different designers would present different designs, and the best one would be chosen. Investment and private enterprise do nothing but take more from the people who are already being exploited. Investment into business that you yourself are not a worker in makes the worker work for you instead of themselves, and disincentivizes the company from giving their workers livable conditions. In other words, doing it for profit rather than for the workers. The same thing is true for private enterprises. Even a charitable private enterprise who wants to pay their workers fairly cannot outcompete those enterprises which are solely focused on profit and nothing else. It'll either be forced to conform to the system, be bought out, or be destroyed by larger monopolies being able to put the price way lower due to them not paying their workers.
Basics out of the way, we can go more in detail with how these issues are interconnected, and we can start with collectivism, which is the prioritization of the group over the individual. And it isn't exactly as noble as it claims to be, as the individual is the smallest minority possible. It's logically impossible for it to be anything else. This sacrifice of the individual kind of puts a dent in the socialist claims of fighting for the good of minorities, as anybody who claims to fight for minorities while ignoring the individual is a liar. Collectivism fails the individual quite harshly, in fact, as evidenced by when Mao Zedong enslaved his own people for the good of the collective to force labor. But it's also a concept that fails on a logical level even when used to judge individuals. Take this simple thought experiment. Say you have a basket of apples, and you pull one apple out. Now, for determining how many dents the apple in your hand has, do you observe the individual apple that is in your hand, or do you look at the entire basket of apples and average out the dents of all the apples and determine the number of dents by the collective? If you guess that looking at the individual apple in your hand is a more accurate measure of the traits of the individual apple in your hand than the collective of apples, congratulations, you have made it over the fallacy of division hurdle and are thus smarter than most Marxists.
What is this supposed to even mean? Is he trying to say that the needs of a single individual should outweigh that of the entire community? Because if so, capitalism does a good job at that. In a capitalist society, some individual apples would be infinitely pristine, while the vast majority would remain rotten and moldy. In the US, for example, the top 0.1% controls over 5 times more wealth than the bottom 166 million people. This explains his argument perfectly, as of course, averaging out all of the apples would yield a worse result than focusing on a single outcome. Under socialism, no apple will not have any imperfections, but at least all of them would have relatively low amounts of them. For example, in the USSR there were no billionaire entrepreneurs, but at least everyone was guaranteed a job, housing, free higher education, and even free medicine. In terms of what is better, if all that you care about is the very best results, capitalism wins. But if you care about having a basket of apples that is actually edible and far better overall, socialism is the only option.
Most Marxists actually are capable of understanding what a fallacy of division is and why assumptions about the individual from an investigation of the collective are not exactly good arguments. But what Marxists certainly do have trouble understanding is what this specifically implies about collectivism. It shows us that the collective does not exist. This creates a very large problem for socialism when it reaches a section of its scheme that involves seizing means of production, and then transferring that means of production to collective ownership. Because the collective doesn't actually exist, this really just means government owning the means of production. People joining hands in a circle and singing Kumbaya hard enough does not cause some collective phantom to pop out and then fairly divvy out the means of production. It is a representational concept and nothing more. So how does a concept own anything? Well, the reality is it doesn't. At least not without being represented by something that is tangible and real and thus actually can own something.
Tangible, like worker councils and Soviets? Did he even read any Marxist theory? Or is he just arguing against Marxism that he made up?
This is where things get really bad and lead to the second problem of media control and how it contributes to how socialism creates dictatorships. Because once the government has such a high level of ownership and control over private property, this generally includes the media.
Media isn't independent in capitalist countries. Corporations own it, and will use it to progress their bourgeois interests.
This is where the connection lies between the collectivist brainwashing and state ownership of the means of production. Once all news is controlled by the state, the people living under this false utopia are then hoisted in kind of a post-truth world where nothing is real anymore. We can observe this in modern times in the absolutely insane statements that are still being made today by the North Korean media, such as their propaganda that their dear leader's emotions can control the weather like he's some kind of Marvel superhero, or claims about the state of the nation's economy.
Ironic that for a source of the propaganda, he uses a bourgeois-controlled outlet.
Level. And finally, the third major issue, which is actually something that will have been brewing the entire time, the problem of competition. You see, as the government takes control over the means of production, they gain full control over the country's economy. This creates a problem because now, instead of being seen as healthy, competition can now instead be viewed as rightist opposition to the state. An example of this was dekulakization in Soviet Russia. If you were a kulak and owned a farm that was too big, this was considered opposition to the collective. Your farm would be seized and you may or may not be sent to gulag. If you tried to resist, you would be flat out executed. And this bar for too big of a farm wasn't exactly that high, only about 5 acres. Imagine if you were a foreign investor watching all this nonsense happen, or any private investor really. Who in God's name would want to throw their hat in a market run by murderous thieves? This means that foreign private enterprise and investments will end up having no interest in investing business or trading with said dictatorship either.
At this point, I don't even think he understands socialism. What he's saying is exactly the point. We don't want foreign investments by bourgeois enterprises, as they will all lead to exploitation and wage slavery. The USSR had a very self-sufficient economy, as shown by its inability to be affected by the Great Depression.
Why would they? If you had a choice between investing into a state that will not steal ownership of your property or investing into a state that absolutely will eventually steal it, which do you pick? So thus, as the totalitarian state marches forward, the state must then start making all business investment decisions for itself. It ends up acting as sort of mega corporation, exactly what it was trying to stop.
The state acting as a mega corporation does not make any sense. The state would be purposed for the workers and their fair compensation, so controlling society for that purpose would be a positive and not a negative. The whole reason why mega corporations are bad is because their primary goal does not reflect that of the people, but that of capital and profit. For the rest of the video, he just makes baseless claims without any evidence or sources, and then builds baseless arguments based on those claims. Then he continued to dismantle common Marxist arguments. As usual, the counter-arguments were either oversimplified or are arguments that are never used by Marxists.
Now that we have finished reacting to the most horrendous parts of the video, here are our thoughts about the trend of socialist countries becoming dictatorships. We'd like to say that there are 4 central reasons for this occurrence. As an example, I will use the USSR. First of all, the state of the Soviets was under legitimate threat of reactionary invasion, and they needed to consolidate fast in order to survive. Due to this, we believe that a dictatorship was needed in the USSR until the 1950s. 1922 to 1930 because of reorganizing the country and crushing internal reactionary forces. 1930 to 1941 developed fast in order to be able to withstand a reactionary invasion. 1941 to 1945, fighting against a reactionary fascist invasion. 1945 to 1950, to rebuild. All of these were forced major situations which we believe necessitated a stronger government. And the USSR was not the only country that developed authoritarian governments in this time period. Even the US moved to a more authoritative regime, as shown by the Red Terror and the deportation of people of Japanese heritage into camps. Secondly, Marxist-Leninist ideology does necessitate an authoritarian government for a transitional period to enforce policies such as dekulakization, which was a largely positive policy and freed millions of peasants from the petty bourgeois exploitation. The USSR was trying to industrialize as fast as they could since they were behind in 1922. Doing this with a stronger hand is easier. We think sacrificing some freedom for fast industrialization was needed as, returning to the point from earlier, the USSR was eventually invaded during World War II. Without this industrialization effort, the Allies would have likely lost World War II. Lastly, socialism never brought Russia to an authoritarian government, as Russia was authoritarian before the revolution and is basically authoritarian right now. In fact, we'd argue that they were more democratic than Tsarist Russia. For example, during their constitutional changes in 1935, they asked people to recommend amendments and voted many of these amendments in. The same argument can be used for both Cuba and North Korea, as neither were democratic before their revolutions. A quote from Parenti sums this up well. He said, "But a real socialism, it is argued, would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, power-hungry, bureaucratic cabals of evil men who betray revolutions." Unfortunately, this pure socialism view is ahistorical and non-falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, and the reality comes off a poor second. It imagines what socialism would be like in a world far better than this one, where no strong state structure or security force is required, where none of the value produced by the workers needs to be expropriated to rebuild society and defend it from invasion and internal sabotage. Effectively, with this quote, Parenti is arguing that the authoritarian turn of the USSR, PRC, DPRK, etc. is a result of external counter-revolutionary forces. That the reason they did not become consumer paradises was that they had to prepare for capitalist invasion, which caused an end to multi-party democracy, syndicalism, the old Bolsheviks, etc.